When they originally announced Balan Wonderworld, a game from the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, Yuji Naka, that looked like it was borrowing heavily from Nights into Dreams, I was ecstatic. Then they put out a demo, which only added to my feelings of excitement. They only do that for good games, the ones that they feel confident people will love and want to play the full release of. And then I played said demo, and I hard passed on the final product. Yeesh, so much for my demo theory. Either way, even after that, and after all the negative reviews and videos making fun of it, there was still a part of me that was morbidly curious as to how everything turned out. When I had the chance to pick it up cheap, I did so, justifying it by saying that it'd make a fun stream. And eventually, I got through the other side. In the interest of continuing to make my decision feel less stupid, let's give it a semi-look through. I'm Wes, the Explosion, and these are my thoughts on Balan Wonderworld. The setup is that you're a child, either boy or girl you choose, feeling a powerful sense of social isolation, so you wander the streets of what looks like Europe until you stumble into a strange theater. Inside, magical fantasy smooth criminal Michael Jackson whisks you away into a strange land where you dive into the minds of others dealing with deep distress to face down the physical manifestations of their depression in order to combat their troubled thoughts, be it shyness, frustration, or stuff that metaphors shouldn't be able to fix, like their cat being run over by a bus. Along the way, you have to face down a tentacled villain named Lance who's possibly dealing with his own intense feelings, ride the Polar Express, and maybe even cut through your own gloom in the process. Or at least I think it goes something like that. The game does that artsy-fartsy thing where there's little dialogue, most of it being in some made-up language called Balinese, with just a bit of English at the very end that's very simple. It's super whimsical, so it kind of works, and it's not really the sort of game that you need to dive too deeply into whatever's happening. And if you are, for some strange reason, there is a novel tie-in that's available only as an ebook. If I wasn't such a sucker for bound paper, I'd probably go down that rabbit hole too, but moving on. I think this game would technically be classified as a 3D platformer, though there's a part of me that doesn't really want to. You have 12 stages, each containing 2 acts and a boss. You can choose which act you want to do first, and when you get to the end, you get a heart that you use at the end of the other act to unlock the boss. As you go through each, you want to be collecting Balan statues, enough of which will unlock more levels for you. These are scattered all over the place. Some of them you can come across naturally, some you just see and need to figure out how to reach them, some you need to keep an eye out for side paths, some you get from bosses, and some you get from these hat minigames. Touch the hat and watch an unskippable cutscene that goes on for a minute or more. Balan flies around, taking out obstacles, and during certain parts, you need to press a button. Right before he pulls off one of his epic moves, a semi-transparent still of him will slide onto the screen, and you either need to wait for it to overlap with him, or if there's a bunch of them, mash. Not really a lot of warning which it's going to be, and it can also be kind of hard to get the timing down when, while the overlay is a static image, Balan is not, so you kinda need to intuit when he'll be in the right position, in the right pose. You do this at least 3 times, though I think we had ones that had up to 6 prompts, and if you complete the sequence perfectly, you get a Balan statue, and if you mess up at all, you only get bonus crystal tears, which I still don't understand the purpose of. These things feel like the world's worst quick-time events, since they are so slow and dragged out, with incredibly dumbed-down controls, yet demand absolute perfection. Otherwise, the whole thing feels like a waste of time. Gonna be honest, started avoiding these late into the game no matter how in my path they were, unless I was exceedingly desperate. Anyway, get enough Balans and you take a victory lap in a fantasy train to open up another set of levels. Simple enough. There's quite the ensemble of costumes you can find, each with an accompanying power. You can find these prism things that contain these suits inside them, and you need a key to open one up. Of course, these keys are typically within eyesight of the prisms, maybe even just a few feet away, so it really feels like they added an extra step just for the sake of it. Yeah, you need to wait for the keys to respawn, so there is a cooldown, but the crystals also don't immediately reappear either, and even so, you could just stretch the one thing's respawn rate rather than giving it 2-step authentication, but hey, what do I know? Each costume lasts for 1 hit. Take damage and you lose it, run out of them and you just revert back to the standard child, who can only run and jump. Take a hit like this and you die, back to the checkpoint. I'd classify most powers into 3 categories. Movement, which will buff your platforming skills to let you reach new places, combat, which give you special offensive options, and obstacle-specific ones that you need to interact with particular fixtures in stages. Some fit multiple roles, like the bat one that pretty much gives you modern Sonic's homing attack to both take out foes while clearing gaps or gaining height, and even the movement or obstacle ones can still be used to attack, typically by just jumping on an opponent, the old standard. Anyway, now's probably a good time to mention the control scheme. Start and select will bring up menus. You can hold up to 3 costumes at once, which you can cycle through with your shoulder buttons, and the rest of them all do the same thing. That means that if you have a power that is strictly attacking, you cannot jump. In a platformer. If you get stuck in a pit without a ramp, hopefully you have something you can swap to. If you don't, hopefully there's something that can damage you to turn you back into your hoppy kid. And if there's not, then menu and exit level, I guess. While I understand that they probably wanted the game to be simple so that even really young kids could play it, sweet Christmas, I don't think a dedicated jump button is too much to ask for, and this can make some sections really frustrating when you either need to take a few seconds to swap to something else just to make a simple hop, or get completely stymied by a 2-inch lip. I appreciate that they wanted a large suite of powers for players to experiment with and try to figure out how best to balance what they kept on hand, but there's simple, and then there's stupid. Anyway, if you get more than 3, one will go into your closet, which you can access at checkpoints to change your loadout. And some powers are exclusive to some levels, but needed for others, so notating certain structures and obstacles, then bringing the right thing back is a big part of the experience. This can be kind of a pain given how easy it is to lose a costume, but at the same time, the closet for your extras at least helps. There's also a few special powers where you play a sport like baseball or bowling in a quick minigame for extra tiers. Maybe a Balan if you do well enough, but if so, I didn't, so I can neither confirm nor deny. As for the stages, they range from okay to mediocre to horrendous. A good chunk have a mini-boss right before the end, where you have to hit a shadow creature that sends out smaller enemies and or attacks you directly 3 times. And like I said earlier, each has 2 acts and a boss, with you being able to choose which act you do first. You gradually open up different sets of stages, there being 12 total, then the final boss. The stages start out fine, on the shorter side, but pleasant and simple enough that it's not too bad getting to the end. Around the midpoint, they get a little more complex, and the big headache is just using some of the powers on offer. The main problems tend to be either the type problem, where you're saddled with an ability that you don't really want to use but just kinda have to, statues that you can see and think you have the right ability to reach, only to find out that no, it wasn't as you fall into the abyss, or something super specific, like a chameleon that can't jump but needs to first-person shoot a fruit with its tongue to ascend to a new platform. So, you know, the first thing I said, but more extreme. And near the end of the game, well, I took a lot of emotional damage. In one, you have to navigate an MC Escher painting. In another, everything was on fire, with a lot of careful jumping and start and stop obstacles. And another was just so damn long, with checkpoints stretched thin. I wanted to die, a desire not to let the game beat me, and Yuji Naka prison time jokes being the only things that kept me going. To sum it up, the levels start out fine, but only get more frustrating the further in you go, and the issues I mentioned with the costumes only exacerbate the situation. They do something kind of clever with the bosses though. Each one has 3 methods of damaging them, and you get a Balan for each one you manage to pull off. Each boss takes 3 hits, so if you're clever, you can snatch them all up in one go, but if not, you can always rematch. It's a bit quicker to do this than replaying a level, searching all the nooks and crannies, so this was a common fallback for us, when we were just a few statues away from opening up the next section of the game. Not only that, but this was probably also the most fun I had. Seeing what costumes the boss fight would provide, what its different attack patterns looked like, and putting together how to use these in conjunction was actually very engaging. I even got excited using that stupid chameleon power to damage the one bird boss while making inappropriate comments. These stacked up similarly to the stages, the first few being really simple affairs where you mostly just attacked, and if there was any specific power you needed to use, it was pretty obvious, to becoming a bit more complex and requiring more thought, to beginning to be a bit more obtuse and inconsistent, to ones that just kind of sucked, due to either being too vague in what you were supposed to do, to things just seeming to not work as intended, but at least they kept their novelty for a bit longer than the regular stages. And then there was the final boss, which was just awful. Unlike every other fight, no powers were provided, meaning if you lost, you might have to go grind for some if you didn't have enough spare outfits in your closet, or you just didn't have a loadout that you thought would work. The fight also goes on for way too long, so failure not only wastes your resources, but your time too. The first phase has inconsistent hitboxes and timing, at least it felt inconsistent to me. The second is kind of neat, you cycling through a handful of power sets to deal damage, but right after that, it's just dodging for a while, which can be awkward if you get that far with the wrong set of costumes. The last bit is simple enough, but it has multiple ways of insta-killing you, such as falling or bumping you with its chin, and given how many bosses require you to knock them down then immediately follow up with an attack, I don't think it was dumb of me to try sticking a little close. And then you have to jump on its forehead jewel, which should have been obvious, but I was pretty exhausted, so I had to do the whole damn fight again. Maybe if I hadn't just been so drained by the game by that point, or passing the controller back and forth between myself and my player 2, it wouldn't have been so hard to pick up and clear, but this really was the twice digested corn on the third Sunday, as it were. Oh, and just in case I'm not selling how much some of these suck enough, if you lose, you get kicked out to the hub, have to re-enter the door, sort through your costumes, skip a cutscene, and then reload the fight, rather than just get a simple retry option. Which gets real old real immediately. My point is, while I like some of the bosses, others still caused me a lot of misery. Then there are these fuzzy bird things. Tim Tams? Tim Tims? Tim Toms? Maybe just Tims? Anyway, these things mosey around the hub area. You can find eggs sometimes in levels that you can hatch here to get more, though sometimes they also seem to pop up unprompted. You can also find these crystal tier things in-game that you can then toss out to feed your Tims. These seem to make them bigger and change their coloration and ears. It also looks like they work for you, a counter at the bottom of the screen ticking up based off of them jumping on small trampolines and turning a crank. When the number gets high enough, the Tower of Tims or Clock of Happiness or whatever gets a new feature added to it, though once it also added in an extra trampoline. And if you beat a level a second time, you get rainbow tears, which you give to a statue to make something happen. What does any of this do? I have no idea. The game never explains it. I'm reminded of the Chow Garden and those weird little baby things you could collect in nights, but while Chows had complex systems for raising and competing them, I don't know if any of these do anything other than look cute and build a tower whose purpose is also aesthetic. While I could very easily look up what all this is for, I think it's a bit more biting if I say that I played through the whole game with another person, sometimes two around, and none of us ever figured out if there was a point to it. Maybe if we had maxed it out, we would have gotten an extra Balan statue or minigame, but we could have just as easily not. If anyone wants to give me a detailed explanation in the comments, feel free, maybe I'll pin it. My point is, this game is obtuse. The visuals are pleasant. There's a part of me that wants to call it a Pixar knockoff, but that feels like I'd be doing both styles a disservice. And part of me that just wants to compare it to the previous Nights into Dreams, but that doesn't feel quite right either. While it doesn't feel fully unique, it works well to get across the whimsy the game's going for, and I like looking at it, from the human characters, to the different areas' little inhabitants, to the costumes you wear, and the weird little shadow creatures that attempt to stop you. I think Balan has a pretty strong design himself, and the villain character, Lance, has enough similarities that you can tell they're opposing forces, but not to the point where he's just a boring, evil version of the character. My only real complaint with how things look are how oddly large the character's hands are. With how big they are proportionally, I almost have to wonder if they were meant to have big Mickey Mouse rubber hose gloves but were switched to flesh without sizing them down, though regardless, most of the humans look like their slaps would be lethal. As for the OST, I'd say it's another strong point. It sounds kinda like they're going for a movie or stage play sort of background music. Perhaps because I don't engage much with either, I don't really remember too much of the specifics. It was enjoyable enough in the moment, and while I don't think it's the sort of thing I would just sit and listen to, at the same time, it's good enough that I could put it on in the background while reading or typing something up. And sometimes there will be some words thrown in. Not sure if they're in Latin or what, but it can be kinda fun to attribute nonsense phrases to it, like Caesar or Bolsack. Then again, maybe it's that same made-up language they use for the dance numbers you get after every boss fight. I could tell it wasn't English, and it didn't sound Japanese either. When we looked it up, it seemed that they created a tongue called Balanese, so I guess I was right. These sound specifically like they were trying to create a Disney-esque sequence. I think there were only 3 or 4 different songs they used, so maybe there was some repetition, but with how bizarre they were, they never stopped being funny. Anyway, I think that's about all the compliments I can justify giving this. Not content to simply subject myself to this, I convinced a friend to stream this 2-player with me, and that was probably a good call. Not only was it a lot more fun to play through with someone to crack jokes at the game's expense with, it also had several mechanical benefits as well. First, it was another 3 slots for costumes. Even if player 2 wasn't allowed to carry them between levels, it was still nice to be able to carry some extras around for a single stage, and made it less stressful trying to figure out whether I should sack one for another. Second, you can link up and move around, so if one player has a power that doesn't include a jump, the other could function as the legs and let your pair use multiple powers at once. Player 2 also won't die, just getting temporarily stunned if they take damage, so you can use their iframes to just brute force some obstacles for statues. It's not all peaches and cream though. The camera focuses on and is controlled by player 1, so unless they stick really close to you, player 2 can get lost pretty easily, which can be frustrating. And when you pair up, splitting again can be tricky, the 2 of you needing to run in different directions for a few seconds. This can be pretty unnerving if you want just one of you to try something tricky and you don't have a wide enough area to separate. And of course, while carrying extra powers is nice, it also means that sometimes you need to decide who's the more strategic pick for picking a costume up. Some powers, like ones that heavily affect the camera or gameplay, can also only be grabbed by player 1. Still, there's more advantages than disadvantages, and while the second player definitely gets the short end of the stick, if you can find someone you work well with and is a good sport about this sort of thing, I'd say this is the way to play. When talking about bugs, I should probably mention that I played the Switch version, which usually winds up being the one with the worst performance, and in this case, was also the lowest rated version on Metacritic, though not by a huge margin. That said, there was a good deal of choppiness, which could screw up timing and inputs, making the game really challenging at points when it was just chugging along. There were quite a few deaths that I refused to acknowledge as my fault. Besides that, there were just a lot of times things felt really inconsistent with hitboxes and whether certain things worked or not. Maybe I was missing something, but either the game is unintuitive to play or sometimes things just don't work as intended. Then again, why not both? There were definitely some boss sequences that at times felt like we didn't have enough wiggle room to properly dodge. There were also several times where the second player would get stuck on something. The 2 examples I remember being once when they took damage and just had their butt on fire for a bit, and another where they tried to jump onto a moving platform, didn't totally make it, and floated in place while the game figured out what to do with them. And then there were 1 or 2 QuickTime hats that wouldn't activate the sequence when we touched them. There's also some weird pop-in, but I think that might have been on purpose. Most stages fold out like a pop-up book and some characters disappear from existence when you get close, but I think they wanted you to see, not touch. So while likely intentional, it can still be a little weird. And we can't forget the crown jewel of our playthrough where, after struggling against the final boss for an hour and a half, the game just crashed as we were watching the ending. I'd show a clip, but that'd be way too much swearing for this video. Of course, I loaned the game to my friend after we were done, and according to him, he wasn't seeing nearly as many bugs, so maybe 2-player is just unoptimized, but I'd still warn you against expecting too much in the performance department. You ever play a game that's hard, but it doesn't feel intentional? Wait, why does this sound familiar? You ever play a game that's hard, but it doesn't feel intentional? Why? Anyway, it's the case again with Balan Wonderworld. The way the powers work, the one-button control scheme, the really dumb, slow QuickTime events, all the things that just aren't explained, Player 2's frustrating lack of options, and of course all the jank. While the escalation in level and stage difficulty was likely planned, given that they just start feeling more frustrating than challenging, and since I question how much of this was play-tested, I can't just give them the credit of saying that this ramp-up was on purpose either. The first part of the game is easy, the second starts getting a little irritating, and the last leg will most likely make people want to pull their hair out. And given that most people probably start a game with the intention of hitting credits, I'd call this game hard, but more due to incompetence and things being unoptimized, as opposed to any grand vision. So obviously I don't like this game, but by how much? Let's find out. There once was a being named Balan, whose game was immediately failing, The controls really lame, all the buttons the same, making creator prime for jailin'. So yeah, just a limerick, could have been worse. While this is one of the worst games I've ever played, it gets just a bit of redemption since it was kinda fun with another person and a stream. It holds much the same appeal as a bad movie. Not the sort of thing you'd want to just plop down and watch, but if you have other people to experience it with, there is some enjoyment to be had out of making fun of it. Of course, it's not one-to-one, since video games are something you have to actively enjoy, but at the same time, it's easier to justify an early retirement than a film that you know you only have another 30 minutes of. To put it plainly, it's the sort of game I would recommend staying away from unless you specifically have someone willing to play it with you, or a streaming audience that get a kick out of it, and even then, make sure you duck out as soon as you get the urge and only pick it up if you can find it really, really cheap. And if that doesn't apply to you, but for some dumb reason you're still curious, either try the demo if that's still available, or just watch someone else play it. I think the worst part about Balan Wonderworld is that it should, on paper, be a 10 out of 10 game. A Nights into Dreams inspired game by the guy behind Nights into Dreams, from Square Enix, whose name used to mean something, that's a cute 3D platformer with a ton of collectibles and a whole menagerie of different costumes with special abilities that you can enjoy both solo or co-op sounds amazing. In fact, when playing this with other people, I was often reminded that many of the ideas and concepts were really solid and that this could have been an amazing game, which I kept having to assure them that, yes, I know. Everything is just so clumsily implemented though, from the control scheme, to the second-class citizen player 2, to the bizarre cutscenes, to the bugs, to the worthless powers and extra load times. They couldn't even get the name right, most people thinking this game is called Balan Wonderland, because that sounds better, but nope, Wonderworld. This game is a train wreck that was almost a masterpiece, and there's something terribly tragic about that distinction, but at this point, that's what we have. The game wasn't successful enough to get overhauled through patches or fund a more competent sequel, and I can't imagine anyone's a big enough fan to fix the game themselves. Maybe I'm wrong and Square will find some way to turn Balan Wonderworld 2 into a tax write-off, but I'm betting that we'll just be left with this dumpster fire and thoughts of what could have been. Oh well, not the first time this has happened and probably won't be the last. Any other thoughts on the subject are welcome, especially if you played it yourself. I know it has a few fans and I'd be really interested to hear a defense of the game, just as long as the crux of it isn't whining about how Kirby does the same thing. He doesn't. But that'll do it for this week, so thanks for watching and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. In the night, Balan's the light.